blessed ministry, from the opportunity to grow and to learn, and to truly to seek that which is the divine image in each one. In Jesus' name, amen. Making the divine image real. From Jonathan, the disciplining of physical, emotional, and mental energies is necessary before one may qualify for the receiving of the dimensional energies of the soul and the divine image. From Henri, criticism is the beginning of judgment. Seeing the hope in each thing is the beginning of righteousness. From the Gospel of Matthew, judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye met, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? In previous talks, I don't know how, for a few years back probably, Walker spoke in depth on how we perceive things. And the beginning of this talk is sort of my spin or summary of what he said in those two talks, or at least I think it's the essence of what he said. What I'll be saying is more simplistic. But to set up the context of the remainder of the talk, it is important that we have these ideas and concepts in our short-term memory or in our frontal lobes. I think that's where it's stored, whatever. We need it in our short-term memory. Our eyes are like a camera. They capture images which travel through neurons and get stored in our brain. On a physical level, these images get filtered and transformed. Not all images can be stored or processed fast enough, so the brain also. In addition, what we perceive is in the context of our past experiences and beliefs. In other words, people see what they want to see to varying extents. When recalling a memory, we have memory errors. Walker called, this is a term, but Walker introduced to us the term confabulation when this happens. In other words, to varying extents, we remember what we want to remember. Our ears are like microphones, but once again, the sound vibrations hit our eardrums and then get filtered and transformed as they travel through neurons and get stored in our brains. And again, what we hear, what we remember as to what we heard, is stored, but in the context of our past experiences and beliefs. And yes, once again, we typically often hear what we want to hear. But things get even trickier with hearing, because often we are not even really listening. We are listening to the background processing going on in our minds. The context in which we perceive things and understand them has probably more to do with our past experiences, good and bad, painful and pleasant. And then when you add in more of what goes on in Maya, things get even more confused. We have all at different times have been in confusing conversation. One reason is that the meaning of a word or phrase in one person's mind can be very different from that in another person's mind. So this is sort of, I guess, a variant on the telephone story where someone sort of tells someone something who tells someone something, and each time it gets a little bit twisted. And by the time it gets back to the person who originally said it, they don't even recognize what was said. But so this is a slightly different version of it, sticking more to this processing theme. So there's a word in person A's mind, which gets translated through all the filters into words that we just talked about, then gets sent forth as sound waves. Person B picks up the sound waves, which get translated through all those filters into words back into their brain, which then gets translated into ideas and emotions totally based on person B's context, not person A's context, which is typically very different from person A's context. In engineering terms, this is a very low signal-to-noise ratio. In other words, there is a lot of static and random noise in the signal, or the true meaning of something is being not received clearly, is what we're saying. It is the rare person who is truly present with a focused attention on what is being spoken by others. Only the enlightened person, and to lesser extent, the spiritually quickened, can see true and hear true. So it is no wonder that in Maya we all live in the Tower of Babel, and everything is confused and misunderstood. As long as we perceive the world through our physical senses and through our body functioning, everything we see and think is biased and distorted to vary, which typically reinforces our biases. Now we know for someone trying to live the spiritual path, that's one of the main things we're breaking down, right? We're trying to not always be thinking through these, but they're there and they're subtle and we have to work with it. And even though we've all made a lot of progress, it's still there. It is, of course, very easy to see this out in the world of politics. But as we've just said, it also goes on to varying degrees inside each of us. This is why it is so important that we work hard to keep our eye on the divine image and to keep our mind on that what our teachers and great souls have taught for thousands of years. Finally, one last point to this very long introduction to the real talk. Given all the things that get in the way of seeing and hearing true, it seems we must all be very careful, especially when we try to infer another person's motives. We struggle enough to see and hear what is just being seen and heard because of all the distortions, the noise that Maya presents. And if one is honest, often our understanding of our own motives is fuzzy at best most of the time. So how in the world can we ever judge another's motives? So trying to keep all this basically in mind, let us what does this say about trying to really perceive and work with the divine image? I'm not claiming I know the answers to all these things. I'm just saying these are things we need to think about and be more aware of. So what are some of the things we do know? We know an enlightened person does see the world through the divine image. Most of us were fortunate to have direct experience with people that were enlightened, right, through our teachers. So we got to observe this. While working on this, at some point, the following kind of, I don't know what it is, flow, prose poem kind of came. An enlightened person is in the present moment. An enlightened person sees truly because they see through the divine image. An enlightened person hears truly because they hear through the divine image. An enlightened person thinks truly because they think through the divine image. An enlightened person hears the single signal that is actually being sent behind the words. An enlightened person has a pure perception of what is really going on. This is because the enlightened person is not only seeing through their physical eyes and hearing through their physical ears. They are seeing and hearing through what we learned about, but we all need to work a lot harder on. They think through and hear through their higher self. They're working with their soul faculties and not just their senses. And all their memories are being stored more in the higher mind and in the greater essence of God. When one sees all through the divine image, then everything is always processed through the divine image. They go hand in hand. When one sees through the divine image, there's a very strong signal, truth, and very little noise. So what this is referred to as the signal to noise ratio is very, very high. The divine image filters out the noise or that which is unnecessary and untrue, leaving a signal that is true, pure, and necessary. So tonight, let us just explore a few pieces of this, all right? So let's open up and look a little more at the importance of compassion, judging not, the importance of not judging, and use of right speech. Clearly, with compassion, we should always do our best that our motives be centered in compassion. This is the core thing, the love commandments. We talk about it a lot, but we also, many of us at least, I do, fail at it all the time. We learn to not judge others. And as we'll see, or there's quotes from Anne Ree at least, that one of the bases that feeds judging is a critical mind. So critical mindedness is something that's really tricky because you're trying to discern and see the truth. At the same time, critical mindedness has sort of this judgment putting down aspect to it. So how does one transcend that? Right speech. We should use our words carefully so as to not do more damage than good. And I know I fail that one regularly. On compassion. The foundational virtue, as always, as we all know, is compassion, or love ye one another. In the Gospel of John, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. From Jonathan, the commandment of love, instant union with the image of God. The more compassion and empathy that we have, the less we will judge. And the less we judge, the more compassion grows in our hearts and minds. And, naturally, the more clearly we will come to see the divine image in each one. One way of trying to think about this that I have found somewhat useful is to understand the idea of developing boundaries without barriers. So, from Anne Ree. In the life after death, something of this kind happens too, but it is not quite the same. For walls of bias and prejudice are spiral-like in the astral world, and one meets them one at a time. In the earth, the walls of bias and prejudice fall, as the walls of Jericho. Few are prepared for the exposure of their sensibilities to the downpouring of light shed on them, and an initiation occurs. At this moment, the one on earth begins the work of his soul. So let's take the pieces apart a bit. So let's consider a person who is all boundaries and barriers. So a boundary means you have it's an enclosure, you have a strong sense of yourself. You know what your core is, right? Having boundaries is important. Having barriers is not, right? Because I'm using the word a very particular way. So a person who is all boundaries and all barriers basically means you are surrounded by a thick, solid wall and nothing gets in. Everything on the outside is other. Everything on the outside, you are constantly criticizing and judging even when you don't think you are. So when you have really strong barriers, that means you basically have little or no empathy. You have little or no compassion. And again, as I said, everything on the outside is other. It is something that is a threat to you. This is a person who is critical-minded and is constantly judging. Hence, there is no perception or very limited perception of even the idea of oneness, with the result that one who is all boundaries and barriers can never see or work with the divine image. Let's look at the opposite. A person with no boundaries and no barriers is a person who is all what I think Anne Ree called sympathy. Okay? Now, sympathy is someone who they have no grounding. They easily get drawn in and stuck in the mud of other people's karma. They cannot, and because of that, they don't have anything. Everything gets through. They get dragged into all sorts of things. Right? And as a result, a person who has no boundaries and no barriers cannot hold to their inner core. And you cannot stand for God. You will just get stuck in every bit of karma around you, and you cannot see clearly. And we have all known people like this, at least at one time. I am defining a person with boundaries, which means they have a strong sense of self, what they're learning, what's important, what's right, at least to the extent that one understands it. And no barriers means that they have empathy and compassion. So you can let, in essence, the pain of another person in. But when it comes in, you work with it through mediation. And because you have strong boundaries, you are maintaining your core and your centering. I think an example of that was Jonathan one time talked about if someone fell into the quicksand and needs help, you don't give them your hand in case they pull you in. You give them a stick or branch. So you can hold on to one end, you reach the branch end, they can grab it, and then you can help pull them out. So you're helping them and you see they're in trouble. But if it really gets, a mess and they're not, they're floundering all over the place, you may have to let go of that branch. Right? When one has boundaries and no barriers, the barriers do let the world in, so you can feel its pain and see it and know what to mediate for. At the same time, those strong boundaries mean you can stand before the storms of life and know that we are all one in spite of the chaos that sometimes has to come in and we have to process. Henry definitely had exhibited a life of boundaries without barriers. And in essence, all of us have shared this many times in different ways. Simply being in Henry's presence blessed you, quickened you, transformed you. It was like instant. Yet we also know at the exact same time, she saw us exactly as we were. There's no fantasy in here. She saw where we were going and she saw where we could go. And we helped each soul along its way, even if she knew that person was not really one of her students, and it was just someone who was passing through. But she'd been sent into her life, and she knew it was her job to work with them, to bless them. She took on intentional suffering in the timing God sent, and always said, "Thank you, Father." She helped each one the right way with total compassion and with no judgment, while totally centered in law and virtue. Henry was able to release and love at the same time. To me, this is the perfect example of a person who has well-defined boundaries, but also no barriers, that she processed everyone and mediated for them. A barrier is like a wall. We build walls all the time as a defensive reaction to protect what we think of as ourselves. Some enclosures are healthy and part of our growth. Some enclosures are walls we use to separate us from the world and ultimately from God. Jonathan wrote, "Separateness is enclosure thinking. As long as a person feels separate from any soul on earth or any star in the universe, he is in an enclosure." Whenever we judge, we build walls of separation, enclosures made by races, religions, nations, families, basically all become sources and a basis for judgment, prejudice, and walls of separation. You're not my race. You're not my nationality. You're not my religion. We also constantly make enclosures with our egos and whenever we sin. And all of these enclosures easily can become prisons. In fact, they are prisons. Prisons we have made ourselves by judging acts of anger, and basically pick any of your favorite virtue one keeps repeating over and over. We'll all have our sort of tricky things we trip over. A truly compassionate person has managed to stop the inner processes that judge and condemn, otherwise, because it's circular. Otherwise, they could not be truly compassionate, right? So obviously, we're talking about the enlightened person reached that ultimate state of compassion. We are all working on it and making I'm talking about this as black and white, and it's not black and white. I mean, there's stages and gradations of all these things, right? So, But these all work together. And some things we can see and work with more clearly. And it seems while, I know I certainly fail at this an awful lot, I can understand compassion and love ye one another. And at least even after I blow it, I can come back and realize I blew it and grab onto it. So to me, it's the thing you can really grab onto and work with, and recognize. And no, I must be, this is not loving. So what is loving, right? So we pray, we meditate, we say mantras, we work on it, we do our practices. A mind without compassion, as we have seen in this world over and over the thousands of years, is a very dangerous thing. With our minds, we image and create the future. If we are disconnected from our heart or do not have a fully integrated heart and mind, what happens? What are we imaging? What other walls we don't know about are we building? What future are we building for ourselves, our children, the world? From Anne Ree, we need to feel through our mind and think through our heart. More and more it is clear that this is the most that's her quote. More and more it is clear that this is the most fundamental building block that enables one to be able to live with boundaries, without barriers, which ultimately enables and goes along with not judging, which also goes along with love you one another, which also is what enables truly being able to work with and see the divine image in a more consistent and loving manner. By the way, I'm writing these things based on, a lot of my own failures and things, so it's not like I've mastered them. It's just like, I know this is wrong, so that must be right. And this is all what it ultimately ends up needs to be able to see the divine image. Judge not, from the Gospel of Matthew. Judge not that ye be not judged. From Anne Ree, one who would spiritually serve his brother must be free of a condemning and judging mind. The techniques of mediative healing may be used successfully only by a forgiving and non-judging person. Right? I mean, that's a really strong statement. We've got to forgive. We got to forgive others, and we got to forgive ourselves. And we give talks on this, but we give it on, and it keeps coming up because it's something we're working with. And when you can't forgive, and you have this underlying kind of critical thing going on that is sort of a judging thing, it basically means that it really is short-circuiting our mediative healing. It's making us much less effective. Even when we mean well. Henry says one must be free of a condemning and judging mind. So we should probably ask ourselves and look inside a little bit. It's like, so are we 100% free? Are you 90% free? Are you 50% free? I know I'm not 100. I can guarantee that. And I'm not sure how high I do get most days. All right. So clearly this is something that really needs to be worked on. A critical and judging mind can hide behind an honest desire to protect the Dharma. To wield the sword of truth, one must make sure they have pure desires, that they are not thinking through their own traumas and sensitivities. Now that said, and this has also been said before from the altar, you got to grow, you got to do things, you got to make mistakes. So if you read all of this and take it really seriously, it's almost like you should be afraid to do anything or to say anything to anyone about anything, or, or even think anything unless it's just pure basic, truth. But that's not how we grow. We grow through our mistakes. But the point is, it's important we learn from that mistake. So, and to do it as little as possible and get better and better at it. Right? As spiritual initiates trying to stay focused on the divine image, do we have the right to judge another, especially a co-disciple? I do not think so. Our focus should always be on law and love and virtue, even subconsciously, even though that's extremely hard. Our focus is on creating spiraling, rising movement. Our focus is to be transformative agents. And to be a transformative agent, based on what Henri said, we cannot judge. If we judge, we just hit the eject button on the spiraling transformative movement, and everyone loses. Us and the people maybe we're trying to meet for or help. Henri wrote, God's justice cannot fulfill its action when one thinks continually with a judging mind. Judging is never kind, and frankly, it is never really true, even when there are some aspects of truth associated with it. I think that's what trips us up. Things are always a little bit true. We want to focus on the part of the true we really want to hold on to, right? This is what makes it so hard. There are all these partial truths that we can get caught up in, but we think we have the truth with a capital T. Now, again, this point of the spiritual life is to learn what those absolute truths are and make that more and more and fill our lives. And we are all doing that. But one can still slip up because there's just so much there and so much inherited stuff and so much ancestry and so much Maya karma. And so it's just there. So we're always struggling with this. Whenever we judge, we are operating at best from partial truths, because if we really saw the full truth, we would never judge. The divine image has nothing partial about it. It is whole, the all, the complete, down to every jot and tittle. Even if one works on this at a mental level and catches themselves, what is really going on often in the emotional body? What is going on in the subconscious mind? It takes a lot of work to see through to the divine image core in each and every person, especially if it is going to be at a deep, heartfelt level, which is what it needs to be. It takes a lot of work to let one's own divine image core to properly shine through, because we have to quit clouding it up with critical mindedness and a judgmental mind, and anger or any of these non-virtues. They cloud this, and then our own divine image can't see through, or shine through, From Jonathan. The judging mind, the critical mind, and the impatient mind negate the attitude of blessing. Such persons add to their offenses through wrong use of the mind. The healing of the judging, critical, impatient mind is necessary before the attitude of blessing becomes a natural expression of love for others. So, even when judging is not blatant, it can often be going on, right? So where does judging, critical mindedness, and prejudice hide, even when we're trying hard not to do it? Well, I don't really know, but a thought came, and I think we've used this sort of metaphor before in other situations, but it hides, I think, a lot of times in the spaces between our thoughts and our words. It's kind of a subtle thing that just kind of slips in, and we don't want it to be there, and we're focused on something else. But part of the discipline of meditating, of all those practices, is to clear all that out, to still the mind. Obviously, there are also many good things hiding in the spaces of our thoughts and our words. Some are virtuous, and some are perhaps things to be manifested through our spiritual knowing. But it's important that we be aware that it's so critical that we work on this. You cannot truly bless from an attitude of superiority. If you look at another and think, I am right and you are wrong, this is not real divine image thinking. Divine image feeling, divine image seeing, divine image imaging. This is not to say, again, boundaries without barriers. You need to know what the truth is. But we need to realize people are where they're at with their atom development, and they're trying to learn and work. And the most important thing in the world for them is to be doing exactly what they need to be doing at that point in time so they have an opportunity to learn that lesson. Even though we may think that lesson is like, oh, this is judging. Duh, I learned that a long time ago. Why are you doing this? Well, that's where they're at. And we should not think that. We should realize and just bless the fact that people are learning and growing. And it's hard to do that sometimes. From Anne Ree, to discipline imprudent imagination, refrain from condemnation, judgment. Envision the soul grace and pure prototypal presence of each person, and look for the angel standing nigh to each one. So here's a very concrete practice, and we have others. We have many others. Well, I could have gone and pulled these out and listed them. You can go look them up, and then the ones that really speak to you will pop out, and you'll build on them. Many years ago, I did have a direct personal experience with an aspect of this. And it's been a while. I don't remember how far, but it's been a while. And there were probably a number, but there was a particular married couple and their children who, to me, were just, I'm going to use judgmental words, awkward disciples, right? And they were really kind of struggling. And for some reason, it just, I'm like, here they go, this kind of thing. I mean, just pure judging. Right? So I had a dream about it, right, to magnify this. And I'm sitting there, and we were all outside in a big group, and we were having like an agape after sort of an outside meeting that had gone on. And I was standing off to the sides, almost a little bit towards the edge of where these woods were. We were like in an open area. And I'm looking at them, and Jesus comes up and stands beside me. And he's looking at them also. And I know he knows what I'm looking at and what I'm thinking, And he says, you need to see them through my eyes. And he takes his, almost like he has a mask. And he takes it and he comes and he puts the mask over my face. And so I'm kind of seeing through the eye, and it's like I'm seeing through his eye. And I'm seeing how, just like Anne Ree had that ability that many of us observed, he's seen them where they are, where they're growing, where they're learning. He has no judgment whatsoever. He's just loving them. And he knows they're working and they're learning and they're making progress. And that's what's important. But it's like, see them through my eyes. And they were non-judging eyes. Right? But he saw the truth of what it was. He wasn't denying the truth of things, but he was seeing the process, the flow, the thing that goes on over eternity and eternities. And it's all a process. Right speech. From Anne Ree, right speech, right thoughts must be as one in the seraphim rod within the Holy of Holies. The main way we express judgment is through what we say, the words we use, the tones in our voice. The mighty tongue, when misused, is how we express our judgment. And Anne Ree's written a lot on the tongue. Buddha's criteria for right speech, he's laid down some very concrete things, are laid out in and I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, the Abhaya Sutta. And in the Abhaya Sutta, what is written is, and these are supposed to be Buddha's words, behold, monks, right speech always consists of 5 characteristics as follows. Speech is spoken at the right time. Speech is true. Speech is sweet, meaning the person is able to, not that it has to, it means the person can hear the message in the right way. If the person can't, but they're saying to the person, this person can't hear this message, you shouldn't be speaking. You shouldn't bring it up. That's my interpretation. Speech is useful and helpful. They can do something with it. Speech, is kind and compassionate. These are the criteria by which we should evaluate every word we speak. Now consider what the Buddha said about wrong speech. Wrong speech gives rise to conflict, division, confusion, and suffering. Knowing this, monks, you should all avoid speaking wrong speech, because it will bring you suffering. The simple guidelines and what I can remember, but still manage to forget in many critical moments. Before you speak, think, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? This is the really simple, boiled down version of it. And you can find posters with these words on it. It's actually a very popular kind of sane passage related to Buddha. Well, is it true? Well, if you really want to say something, you think it's true, right? You wouldn't want to say it, right? So it's kind of good to say a prayer before someone intervenes into something or tries to. Is it necessary? This is why we need to learn discernment and judgment. Again, working your practices, being dedicated, doing things that get one in the flow, connect one with their higher mind and higher aspects, connected with the coinciding principle and the flow that connects things, gets you in right timing, right? So we know about these things, and I know it's almost impossible to keep this all straight, and it's not, in a way, it's not our job to keep it straight, right? It's our job to do as best we can with what's being magnified in front of us, and let the angels and the coinciding principle kind of take care of it, and it usually does most of the time, right? And is it kind? I don't know. These are tricky to really decide, and again, you have this problem of, if I really think about this hard, would I ever say anything to anybody about anything, right? And I'm not sure that's necessarily right either, because again, we got to make our mistakes so we learn from them. But clearly, we all need to use judgment and care. So basically, it seems like first we must all learn to think before we speak. A major problem I have, because my mouth just goes. This is hard, especially in an intense moment, as we all know. This is hard when maybe something's being said and we really feel it's wrong, especially if we're defending ourselves or our ministry or our teacher or something. You get caught up in the heat of the moment. And it's hard when we think we really know best, But ultimately, for everyone, and this is important that we work on this more too, because it's so blatant in the world, we've got to everyone in the world, we just have to stop hurting each other. Everyone just wants to blame everybody else for everything else, judge everybody for everything else. It's everybody else's thought. I'm 100% right. You're 100% wrong. But obviously, we all know that's not true. You're partly right, and they're partly right, and we're working to find the real truth. And if we would work harder and put God first and keep seeking the divine image, it would happen a heck of a lot faster than is happening. So an example of this, which to me was interesting, again, was many years ago. There was a period where Nisha and I had the opportunity to drive, especially Anne Rhee, home after meetings up in Northern California. Because there was especially that period when they were building the house here, and they moved up there for about a year and a half or something, especially when you added in the summer months that were going on. So Anne Rhee would often be very tired and would need to go back to rest. And one time we were driving both of them back. But before that, what happened in the meeting up in, I don't know if it was in the House of Four Winds or actually in the Monterey, that fancy building. Pardon? Conference Center, thank you. But something was, for some reason, something came up with someone, and it was sort of a positive thing in general. But Anne Rhee, when she went to say something about this person, just kept blessing them and saying stronger and stronger words of like praise and, really like this person was doing these great things and blah, blah. I mean, really kind of, and it was almost like she was pouring it on, and I'm like, well, I know she knows what she's doing, so I don't know what this means, right? And then the strange thing was, when we're driving them home, they're in the back seat. She turns to Jonathan and says, if so-and-so doesn't clean up his act, he's not going to be on the spiritual path much longer, right? So it's like there's sort of two realities going here, but she was trying to use constructive, positive, blessing speech And it was sort of like an unusual Vajra. Instead of like a Vajra that sometimes it's like direct or stings, or it kind of hurts, she was doing a Vajra kind of thing, but with very, very positive, blessing kind of words. And I've never forgotten it, never quite figured out how to use it myself. But it's just, to me, it's just when you are enlightened, have that discernment. You know how to pick and choose those things. But it does go to show that right speech is tricky. So to wrap up, from Anne Ree, in the heart dwells the past, the present, and the future. Before the spirit of truth can take possession of the heart chakra, one must be freed of the sensual, instinctual reflexes of judging. To judge not and to live with boundaries without barriers is very difficult to do, especially in the growth process, because as one digs deeper, judging and barrier building can become very, very subtle. And as was discussed, we can have basically right motives, at least on the surface of something, and yet it can end up being misused, because we don't stick to certain basic principles, because we forget, because we want to defend something that's probably very important to defend, but there's right timing and right and wrong ways to do it. In the later stages of one's spiritual development, this can become a major stumbling block that must be overcome to keep moving forward. It can be like a trap. This can be thought of as the divine image initiation, because we cannot see the divine image or think through the divine image or feel through the divine image if one has barriers and when one is judging or being critical of others. So there's that fine line between discernment, seeing the truth, wanting to be and represent the truth, and yet not crossing that line. And I think that's one of our main things we have to learn, and that a great spiritual person, a truly enlightened person, has learned, has mastered. One can never know the truth of all the intersecting karmas in this world. We can know virtue from non-virtue. We can know the law, but even then, unless we are enlightened, we typically do not know what is right or wrong for that person in that instant in time. In essence, if we intervene in someone else's life, it's really like we're trying to micromanage another person's growth process when we're not even managing our own all that well most of the time, right? We are micromanaging when we image how we think another person gets to a more virtuous state or what their next step needs to be. It's between them and God. Micromanaging another's karma or their attitudes is just another form of judgment. Even if in absolute terms we know what's better, it doesn't mean it's what's best for them at that instant in time. And one could learn in a more detached, objective manner, maybe a little later, to bring up that absolute truth in a different context where it's not loaded, so those words are placed there and planted in their mind, and then they can work with it in their own timing. To see through the divine image, we must become non-judging observers. We can image a state of wholeness or virtue. This is mediation that provides support and an image of wholeness that a person can draw upon. Just like our teachers, we must come to see where a person is at, as well as where they're going and their wholeness. And the best thing we can do with our imperfect knowledge is know it's a long, eternal process. And everything we see is one step along that road. And we must help others by always accepting what is being magnified, and as we have talked so many times, accept it as our own. All virtues, all attitudes, one's understanding and fulfilling the law is on a continuum. The difference between a person walking the spiritual path and those who are not is really a matter of degree. No matter how much progress we have made on the path, we still have a ways to go, or clearly we would be more enlightened than we are, in spite of all the growth we've certainly have observed in everyone and how much everyone's growing. There's always more to go. And I guess the bottom line, if you want to boil it down to one sentence, when you get down to it, We have no right to ever judge another, even unintentionally. So let's pray for each other that we don't do that. I'd like to conclude, that this was part of my talk at the conclave, with this passage from Jonathan. I don't think it's really a mantram, but I'd like us to use it as a mantram. And it has a lot about the image, and I think it plants seed. There's something in it that to me is mantra or mantram-like. So please repeat. Think through the image. Love through the image. Create through the image. Rejoice through the image. For the image of God is the Creator's gift to each of his children, through which they are eternally linked to his mighty will and plan.